Well, I have to say that this was a welcome surprise, and that was that I looked at the Wall Street Journal about a week ago and saw that they had this article that talked about how collectors are transitioning from, let's say, vehicles that people would view as classic cars, Corvettes, Camaros, Mustangs, GTOs, and, well, even true classics like Packards and the coach-built cars of the 1930s, to more everyday classics. And the everyday classics are really the ones that are interestingly fast appreciating in terms of price. The article talks about how somebody brought a Chevrolet Cavalier to a car show and how an individual who was driving a Corvette told them to get that piece of junk out of there. And also details some people who are collecting Ford Tauruses, as an example, not even the show models or the super high output models. Then I had another surprise, and that was that a viewer sent to me a Today Show clipping, so the NBC Today Show, and it briefly showed a picture of my Pontiac Grand Ville, my 1971 Grand Ville, in the photo that you see here. That's a screenshot from the episode. And, well, you can watch the entire episode if you follow the link in the description. I have to say I was surprised that the host even called out Pontiac Grand Ville. Not quite sure how she got the picture of my car or why she selected it. But, well, it's great. And I have to say, it does indeed appear that the everyday car is really starting to take off in collector circles, not just within the United States, but also overseas. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. Well, first of all, let's talk about why these everyday cars were never really popular to begin with from a collector standpoint. Part of that is because the folks who were driving these everyday cars back when they were new were, well, let's just say they weren't necessarily part of the cool crowd. It was your grandparents or your parents were driving the station wagons or the big full-size cars, whether they were two-door or four-door. And, they weren't necessarily perceived as being something that a younger person would want to drive, like the GTOs and the Camaros and the other performance vehicles of the era. Now, fast forward many decades later, the people who are driving the GTOs and the Camaros and the Firebirds and the Mustangs, well, they're generally aged. they're kind of the people that they thought were uncool years ago. It might be hard to admit that, but that's true. And so I think what's happening now is that the general collector market is also seeing that the cars, the full-size cars in particular, and the everyday cars that have been underappreciated, well, there's a sense of nostalgia for them, particularly the 80s era cars right now, and some of the 70s era cars. And people want them again. And frankly, one of the things is they're hard to find because they were never preserved. I think I read a statistic that of 1965 Mustangs, there are about 500,000 that were produced for that model year. There are still 50,000-ish registered in the United States, so 1/10 of them survive. If you want to pick a car, though, like a 1973 Ford Galaxy as an example, just your standard everyday car like the black one that I own, Ford sold hundreds of thousands of those back in the day. But how many are left in terms of what's left in the United States? Probably a couple hundred. So the survival rate is much, much lower on these everyday cars. And there's fewer left because they were just kind of used up and discarded, and nobody thought to preserve them. People always thought to preserve Corvettes and kind of the sports cars because they weren't necessarily viewed as everyday cars, or they were a second car or even a third car in many households. But the Mercury Marquis, the Ford LTD, the Chevy Impala, the Caprice, the Pontiac Grand Ville even, those were just everyday cars that people drove. And as a consequence, they're pretty much gone. The other thing that's happened is the overseas collector market has really picked up for full-size American iron. I think part of this is the fact that there really were no cars that were this big overseas. And in fact, the bigger the car, the more over-the-top the interior in particular, the more overseas collectors really want it. And I've seen overseas collectors in Germany, in Denmark, in the Nordic countries, pay more than top dollar for big full-size American cars, have them shipped over there and imported. They want that. I think historically the muscle cars were too expensive to really make money on for importers. And so the importers thought that they had a little niche with some of these full-size cars, and also the buying public over there loved them because they were huge and comfortable. And so those have become very popular overseas. In fact, a friend of mine who's very big in the Mercury circles and does master restorations herself, yes, herself, and has restored many Mercuries to I would say, a pristine level. She's based in Norway, and there's a huge following for Mercuries in Norway. Who would have ever thought that Mercury would be a big brand in collector car circles in Norway? Same, by the way, with Chryslers. There's a lot of Chrysler and Mopar fans over there. So you really have a confluence of factors in terms of what's driving the collector market and valuation these days. Corvettes really haven't gone much of anywhere in the last several years. But these full-size cars and the everyday cars have become somewhat expensive. If you've got a low-mileage Cimarron like mine, that was a car that 10 years ago, I think even a pristine one, you'd be lucky to get probably $2,000, $3,000 for. Maybe if you're pushing it, $4,000. Today, a pristine, ultra-low-mileage Cimarron would not surprise me if it sells for close to $20,000. Which is more than a lot of other sporty cars or cars that used to be viewed as collectibles of the era, because there are no Cimarrons left, except I have a 9,000-mile one, of course. And as the millennials and the Gen Zers really start having some more money in their pockets and are looking to relive a bit of their childhood, the cars that they're gravitating to are really those cars that they remember from yesteryear, the 80s and 90s era GM, Ford, and Chrysler everyday sedans. Let's be honest, outside of the Viper and the Vet, well, maybe the Camaro and the Firebird, but there really weren't that much in terms of exciting cars of the 1980s and 1990s. One could even say a lot of the cars that were sports cars of the era weren't even that exciting because they were so down on horsepower compared to the 1960s era cars, as an example, that they weren't really all that fast. Like a 1984 Corvette with an automatic, I think goes 0 to 60 in probably 7.5, maybe 8 seconds. It's really not that fast at all even the standards of the day. If you wanted something to go faster, you bought a Corvette from 20 years prior, and you were going to out-accelerate it pretty handily. So that gets to a point in this video where I wanted to give some tips for those who are trying to get into this, I'll call it classic car market, and you're looking to buy an everyday car from the 80s and 90s. What should you look for, and what might you want to watch out for? Well, here are some of the tips. First thing I would say is be wary of anything that has a carburetor that is made in the 1980s. And yes, there were carbureted cars even in the early 1990s. GM full-size cars like the Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham still had carbureted engines under hood. So you have to be wary of the 80s era carbureted cars in particular. And that's because the technology was such that they were trying to make the cars run and pass emission standards and also have respectable performance. But that often meant complicated electronics, tons of vacuum lines, and also now just it's very hard to find parts for a lot of those. I would say in particular, if you have a nostalgia for 80s era Japanese vehicles, Toyotas, Hondas, Nissans, you're probably not a viewer of this channel, although it may surprise a number of you that I love 80s era Hondas. I think that they really were a benchmark in terms of cars that were produced during their time, especially the engines and the transmissions. And I like old Toyotas too. I'm not really a Nissan fan, but I do like old Toyotas, like vintage Cressidas and things like that. Never owned one, driven them, I think highly of them. But I would just say be careful in terms of buying a Japanese car in particular with a carburetor. But that applies to more than just Japanese cars. It applies to Chryslers, the carburetors that they used on their 2.2-liter four-cylinder engines, the Mitsubishi 2.6-liter engine that was under hood in quite a few Chryslers of the era, the Ford variable Venturi carburetor, Rochester electronic two-barrel carburetors under GM hoods. They were not all that great to begin with, and now it's really hard to source parts. And one of the things that you don't want to do is buy a vintage car looking to kind of relive your childhood, and it just doesn't turn out to be as great as what you imagine. I highly recommend going for a fuel-injected car that gets rid of all those vacuum lines. And the fuel injection setups back then are pretty robust and reliable. You might have to replace some injectors or some minor components, but by and large, they are pretty gosh darn reliable, and they're very simplistic by today's standards. Especially GM throttle body injection systems, those are really the benchmark. They're almost bulletproof. They run and run and run forever. Ford had pretty decent throttle body systems as well, particularly as you went to I would say the mid-'80s. And once you get a Japanese car from the 80s with fuel injection, it's just much more reliable and easier to service. Honda actually, on a lot of the 80s cars, they had, I think, the most vacuum lines I've ever seen under hood anywhere. And of course, all those vacuum lines now are becoming brittle. They had solenoids under hood to help control emissions and activate different things. The parts are just impossible to find. It's hard to find anybody to work on it. It's hard to diagnose. Just get something that's fuel injected, and it's much easier. The one exception to that, I would say, is GM Rochester Quadrajet, cars with Rochester Quadrajets that are electronically controlled. Those aren't too bad. They are more complicated than the regular Quadrajets. They have a mixture control solenoid, throttle position sensors, sensor, I should say. But they're really not that bad, and not all that much more complicated than the standard Quadrajet. And it's a single carburetor where a lot of parts are still available. That would be the one exception. But otherwise, stay away from carbureted cars of the 1980s. Just not a great example. Now, while I say stay away from carbureted cars of the 80s, if you want to go back to 1970s, 1960s, 1950s, carburetors then really were not all that problematic. They're much simpler. They don't have the electronic controls. Unless you want to start getting into like the mid-70s Chryslers with the lean burn setup. I would not recommend that either. But yeah, you go back before that, kind of to the early 70s, the 1960s. Carburetors were very reliable, very simplistic. You might have a little bit of issues with today's ethanol fuel and have to do some massaging, putting in new needle and seats and things like that. But overall, I would just encourage you, don't be afraid of carburetors. They are just fine if you want to go to an older car. And there's not that mess of vacuum lines because there weren't those emission standards back then. And the cars run a lot better. They have more power, particularly cars from 1970 and earlier. So my encouragement would be, if you want an old car, you're not looking to necessarily just relive your childhood, go a little bit older. And I think the sweet spot for American cars is really 1965 to about 1971. You get, in general, great brakes, even if they're drum brakes. They're pretty gosh darn good. You have the creature comforts like power steering, power brakes, air conditioning on the upper end cars, power windows, power locks, automatic climate control, automatic headlamp dimming in some cases, automatic headlamp turn on too. So you have a lot of creature comforts in that era. And you have relatively sophisticated, I would say, suspension systems to complement the brakes. And they ride great. The engines are reliable. They're just wonderful vehicles. Once you start getting into the latter part of the 1970s into the 80s, automakers weren't just necessarily trying to save cost. They were trying to save weight. And as a result, the componentry got lightweighted. The transmissions got smaller and less robust. Even let's say the window regulators for the power windows became less robust. They used plastic components in them as opposed to mostly metal components like a lot of the window regulators did years prior. So you start having a lot more failure points, especially for cars that are 40, 50 years old, when you get into that late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s era, because a lot of those cars had gone through lightweighting, and there's a fair amount of plastic parts in them. And of course, plastic just doesn't hold up necessarily over 40 or 50 years. So you're looking for a bit more trouble, I would say, if you're getting into that. So stay away from the computer-controlled carbureted cars, except the GM Quadrajet cars. The other piece I would say is really do your homework on the engines and transmissions in the cars of the 80s and 90s, because you don't want a bad one. Now, General Motors had quite a few good ones, even if they were crude, like the Iron Duke 2.5-liter four cylinders, crude but reliable. The GM 3800 V6s, notice I didn't say the 3.8 liter V6s, because to be honest, the 3.8 liter V6s, I would say up through the 1985 model year, actually aren't all that robust and reliable, amazingly. They're kind of 120,000, 130,000 mile engines, and then the lower end starts kind of going on them. Same with the 3-liter V6 that was derived from that, from GM vehicles of that area. That is a terrible engine, that 3-liter V6, with one of those electronic feedback carburetors. That's probably an 80,000 mile engine. But the 3800 that came out in 1988, well, that is, I would say, about a 300,000 mile engine. It's an excellent engine. The V6s, the 85, 86, 87, 3.8 liters engines, maybe 140,000 mile engine, 150,000 mile engine, but still nothing compared to the 3800. Over at the Ford lineup, I would say be careful of the 3.8 liter V6s. Some of the 4 cylinders that Ford had also had a tendency to blow head gaskets. Some of the 2.3 liter 4 cylinders. Chrysler, they weren't horrible. The overhead cam 2.2, 2.5 actually weren't bad unless they were turbocharged. Then they really tended to have head gasket issues. Some of them did have head gasket issues anyway. So you have to be a little bit careful there. The Ultra Drive transmissions, the 4-speed electronically controlled automatics that found their way into Mini Chryslers in the 1990s, you really got to be careful of those, that they fail and then go into second gear. I would say the Ford transmissions of the 80s and 90s, the automatics, not necessarily all that great either, although some of them weren't all that bad. The rear-wheel drive transmissions weren't all that bad. The front-wheel drive transmissions were okay. The GM rear-wheel drive transmissions, mostly okay, except turbo hydromatic 200s. Watch out for those. The full-size front-wheel drive cars with the 440T Ford transmission in 1985, 86. 87, it was better. 88, it was, I would say by 88, they were really good. You got to watch out for cars with that transmission. So just do your research and your homework on the engine and transmission combination, because they're just not as robust. If you wanted to go back to the early 1970s and you picked a Ford, a Chrysler, or a GM with a cast iron V8 engine and automatic transmission from 1971, I don't think there's a bad one out there. You could just pick any of them, and they're going to be, I would say, good to great. But once you get into the late 70s and the early 80s, you really have to start watching, no matter if it's GM, Ford, or Chrysler. Even GM, the Oldsmobile 403 engine, I wouldn't consider great. Just hollow main bearing webs, weak lower ends, Pontiac 301, 2 counterweight crankshafts. You just start getting into that light weighting era, and things are not as good or robust as they were a few years prior. The other thing I would say is you want to make sure that everything works, particularly the electronic components. A lot of digital dashes, digital touch screens, like Buick had their control center that was a CRT touchscreen, very advanced electronics for the time. And of course, now these electronics are becoming rather aged, and it's almost impossible to find somebody to repair them. You want to make sure that it works, make sure the car has low mileage, hasn't taken a lot of road shocks. If you have a Corvette, there are people who rebuild those Corvette gauge clusters, as you'd expect, because there's a lot of people who collect vintage Corvettes. But you just have a lot of wacky electronics. The Corvette, as an example, is a 4+3 manual transmission with a electronically controlled and automatic overdrive. It's basically a 4-speed manual with a overdrive unit, a computer-controlled overdrive unit attached to it. There's not that many people who rebuild those anymore. They still exist, but again, just complicated things that they were doing in terms of fuel economy and emission standards. So watch out for that. And lastly, I would just say that you want to make sure, particularly for the early 80s era cars, a lot of them are unibody. You're not buying a car that's been in the Salt Belt and has been driven in a lot of winters, because you're going to find the subframes are just not holding up, particularly the Japanese cars with, I would say, paper-thin undersides. You really have to look at the underbody and make sure that the rocker panels are solid, the subframe is solid, because even more so than the full frame cars of the 60s and 70s, those 80s era cars just didn't quite last. So make sure you look underneath them. I would say the sheet metal, like a lot of companies started using galvanized exterior body panel sheet metal, so the doors can look good. The fenders and quarters can look relatively good, but the underbody was not galvanized oftentimes, and it can just be in not great shape. So be sure to watch out and look under the car to ensure that it's not rusty. But I have to say, overall, I'm quite happy that the everyday car is getting its due. And if I had to give you a few words of encouragement, I would say maybe if you're just going to look out for an old car and you want to drive something that's older, go find something from the mid-60s to early 70s. I think you're going to be a lot happier and enjoy the car more, and get one with a large engine, let's say an engine over 360 cubic inches, so on the larger side. And I think you're going to enjoy it a heck of a lot more. It's going to be more reliable for you. You can make it a daily driver even, aside from don't drive it in the snow and, the terrible weather. But they're just more reliable, and they're more pleasant to drive. They're smoother, they're quieter, they're powerful, they're reliable. Components don't break. And if something does break, it's often mechanical, and you can even kind of make something that works if you have to, like a heater control cable, versus an electronic actuator, which is going to be impossible to find all these years later. So I would just highly encourage you. Again, the sweet spot for me is about 1965 to 1971. I find maybe 1970 for GM cars. Ford and Chrysler I'd put through 1971 because they still had the high compression engines, whereas GM did not for the 1971 model year. And I think you're just going to be a lot happier. And you push a few years beyond that, 72, 73, it'll be a pleasant experience. 74 is kind of an iffy year because that was the year that you had the starter interlock. You couldn't start the car unless the occupants were belted. And emission standards really started rearing their head, and I would say 72, 73, and they hadn't quite figured out how to fix them until the catalytic converter came out in 75. So just something to be aware of. But if you find a classic American car, don't be afraid to go older. Just get something with low mileage and in great shape, and I think you're going to really, really enjoy it. So let me know what you think. There's some tips. Thanks again for watching.